briefly about religious norms and the norms in human rights instruments and examples. So when we think about historical examples of reparations, obviously there are examples where governments have offered reparations not to those who were owned, but rather those who were the slave owners. In the case of the United States, Great Britain, and Haiti, extending reparations post-abolition to slave owners. But we have, certainly in this country, enslaved persons who've gone to the courts in the 1700s, in the 1800s, to seek reparations for their capture, for their enslavement early on. We have figures no less than Frederick Douglass and Thomas Jefferson who spoke of the need for reparations. And of course, the descendants of slaves have also lifted up the call for reparations, going obviously back to David Walker, to Frederick Douglass, going back to James Foreman, and certainly to those in Congress who are lifting up that debate today. These examples also speak to religious norms which undergird some of the moral philosophical underpinnings of this country and inform the reparation debate. So when we think of, for example, the theological principle of teshuvah in Judaism, which informs the Christian notion of reconciliation, this, of course, is premised on this idea that when one engages in reconciliation or makes amends for a sin, one engages in restitution to the victim. Similarly, in the context of Islam, this notion of justice speaks to restoration to victims. When we think about norms within our human rights instruments, we think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We have groups like that, the Movement for Black Lives, citing the norms in international instruments to give some philosophical grounding for this discussion of reparations for African Americans. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay. So I'm here going to turn the discussion over to my colleague, Linda Bilmes, who will take us from norms into the compensatory mechanisms that speak to this reparation debate today.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Cornell. So I have to admit that when we first started on this project, I didn't know a great deal about this topic. But when we began to study it last fall, what I discovered is that the federal government and state governments spend hundreds of billions of dollars every year on dozens at the federal level and hundreds of programs at the state level on programs that provide various types of compensation for harms. And these programs come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. There are programs to recompense for physical harms like workplace injuries, for economic harms to communities and individuals and businesses who are displaced through trade, for example. There are property holder compensations. There are some narrow precedent type of programs. There are programs that go from generation to generation, including veterans and Indian affairs programs. There are a range of programs for the environment. But what was clear to me was that the government has got a set of norms itself for helping address the consequences of different types of harms. If I can have the next slide, please. This is just a subset of some of the programs that pay compensatory restitution. And we couldn't fit them all on one page, but just to give you a flavor of the variety of these. And the more we looked, the more we found. There are probably, just on trade assistance alone, there are probably more than 50 programs that provide compensation. So let me talk for a minute about how The government determines eligibility for these kind of programs and how they pay for these programs. Next slide, please. The eligibility is typically defined in one of three ways. There are programs in which a specific group of people are determined eligible, for example, the 9/11 Victims Fund. There are programs which are for a particular type of injury, for example, vaccine injuries and the Hemophilia Fund. And there are the largest group of programs which are hybrids. For example, the Veterans Disability Compensation Program, which spends about $250 billion a year on veterans benefits and veterans health care for veterans, for spouses, for dependents, for descendants, for children of veterans, on a really wide range of programs which are determined based on the type of injury or illness or aggravation of something that was precipitated during the time that a veteran was in service. And let me just give you a couple of examples of these kind of programs. So if we could have the next slide. So one typical way of funding these programs is through excise taxes. So for example, one which is in the news at the moment, there is a National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which provides compensation to people who were injured by vaccines that are FDA and CDC approved. So the way this works is that every vaccine administered in the United States, the manufacturer pays a 75-cent excise tax based on or higher if the vaccine tackles more than one disease. For example, the measles, mumps, rubella, the manufacturer pays $2.25 per vaccine. And that money goes into a trust fund so that anyone who claims injury can file a petition. And the principle here is that although the government clearly did not deliberately harm individuals, but that the government plays a role in that the FDA approves the vaccines with the knowledge that a small subset of people will be harmed through the vaccine. And in return for paying this excise tax, the manufacturers are indemnified against legal class action suits by those who are injured. And the funding for this is put into a trust fund, as most of these programs are. Trust funds in the federal government, there are many, hundreds of trust funds at the federal level. Trust funds are not quite the same as private sector trust funds, but trust funds are an accounting mechanism that track inflows and outflows in the federal government. And so when the trust fund is in surplus, it is held in non-marketable treasury securities. And when it is in deficit, the federal government is obligated to borrow to top up the trust fund. Now, I think a program like this immediately makes you think about the issue of reparations for consequences of housing discrimination in a different way. It's not very hard to imagine a program in which an excise tax would be paid by those housing mortgage companies and lenders who were involved in redlining and housing discrimination. If I can see the next slide, please. So the trade adjustment programs are very interesting because these are quite substantial in terms of spending. In 2016, they were spending $1.9 billion a year. The GAO found at least 15 different programs, as well as a tax expenditure in that year. And each program is structured differently. Some of the beneficiaries are individuals, some are firms that have been adversely affected by trade, and some are communities. There are multiple programs. So for example, the Department of Labor provides direct aid mostly to communities. The Department of Defense has got at least 6 programs. So for example, if a weapon system is canceled or if there's a BRAC base closure, the communities and individuals affected are paid compensation. The USDA has a program which funds communities and firms as well as individuals in the textile industry. As the textile industry has declined, the Appalachian Regional Commission has a whole range of different programs having to do with coal mining. There's also a health coverage tax credit that is a tax deduction for the after-tax cost of health insurance for individuals who lose jobs due to trade, and a variety of additional programs that are administered at the state level. Now, this again demonstrates the principle that these are kind of no-fault consequences of the fact that the government has taken actions through trade policies that have an adverse effect on some individuals in society, even if they benefit the overall society. I can have the next slide, please. Another example is the American Indian Trust Fund. So in the 1880s, the American Indian nations signed treaties with the United States which ceded land titles in exchange for sovereignty, but retained the resource rights, that is the rights for drilling, mining, grazing, timber, etc. But the federal government, which did act as a banker and secured the funding raised through activities, in part mismanaged and in part just siphoned off and stole all of the proceeds of this. So after many decades of various kinds of litigations and negotiation, in 2010, there was a settlement for some of the descendants of the original mineral rights dating back to 1887. And this, through this settlement, the descendants are entitled to small shares of parcels which are throughout future generations being subdivided. So right now, the Department of Interior oversees about $44 million in acres and oversees all these activities such as grazing and mining and so forth, and distributes around, it brings in about $5 billion a year, it distributes about $1 billion a year to descendants of the original treaties. And this will continue to be subdivided. So they expect that by 2030, there will be 11 million people who will be receiving some payments through this original program. And I think these are just three examples, but what they demonstrate is, first of all, that as you can see, there is a very strong norm for compensating the effects of harms. And secondly, there is a precedent for compensating intergenerational effects of harms. And with that, I will I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Cornell.
With this matter of reparatory justice, we are confronted with two challenges. The first of which is that reparations, reparatory justice for African Americans seems a matter of sui generis. It is a thing unto itself and distinctive. Secondly, related to this is this notion that this is a programmatic fiscal normative impossibility. This research suggests that the diversity and variability of compensation programs not only demonstrates what has been done, but what might be done, right? As a matter of law and policy and fiscal practice, African Americans are inexplicably excluded from categories of compensation, both as a matter of practice, but also as a matter of definition, like how we define a problem. Who do we define as a victim class? The sheer number, variety, and complexity of the programs demonstrate that it is possible to compensate harms that are rooted in, but not limited to, the time of chattel slavery. Developing new and expanding existing categories of compensation to address these harms is normatively consistent to what we already do. I think incredibly important to note here. And then when we consider the range of harms and the victims addressed by government programs, compensating the taxonomy of racial harms is not a departure from precedent. It would be a radical departure from precedent to not do so, right? So in other words, these programs, what Linda has lifted up just in terms of the range, the multiplicity, suggests what can be done, and it is substantial advancement in the discourse and the conversation in which we find ourselves. So with that said, thank you, and we'd love to welcome your questions.